Hi everyone, in this video I'll tell you about top 10 Chinese novels of all time. They are the best of the best in the span of some 700 years. 5 of them are classic novels and 5 are modern novels. In separate videos I've reviewed a Chinese bestseller, Wolf Totem, and one of my favorite novels by Yu Hua. I'll link those videos down below so you can watch them here. I'm very new to Chinese literature, so I want to explore Chinese literature a little bit more. So this video is just an introduction to Chinese literature. Okay, let's begin with the biggest novel of all time. Romance of the Three Kingdoms by Lu Guanzhong. China as a country doesn't have a national epic, but if you have to pick a novel that comes the closest, is Romance of the Three Kingdoms. It's written in 14th century during Ming Dynasty by Lu Guanzhong, who lived between 1330 and 1400. But experts believe it existed in oral tradition and he simply compiled them into a book and today considered one of the most important works of Chinese literature. It's about 800,000 words long, has more than hundreds of characters. The story is about the fall of Han Dynasty, which ruled China between 206 BC and 220 CE, and the aftermath when China gets divided into 3 warring kingdoms. So people believe it's 40% fiction and 60% history. It's mainly about loyalty between men, war strategies, military skills, diplomacy. So as a result, it's been used to teach warfare, business, as well as history in China, Japan, and Korea. It's been translated to English many times. Romance of the Three Kingdoms is one of the 4 great Chinese classic novels. And unlike some other Chinese classic novels, it has not been subject to censorship by various regimes in the past 800 years, simply because it tells the story of the rulers of the country, not those who opposed the establishment. So it's a very pro-establishment novel. Okay, the next pick is also written in the 14th century. Water Margin by Shi Naian, who lived between 1296 and 1372. But these dates are not certain. Water Margin is an epic novel about a group of 108 outlaws rebelling against the tyranny and injustice, somewhat similar to the tale of Robin Hood. It is set during the last days of Song Dynasty, which ruled China between 960 and 1280, when these men were forced to become bandits and outlaws. It is based on a real historical bandit called Song Jiang and his friends. Due to the nature of outlaws, scholars believe these stories became very popular during the Mongol period in China as they were considered less civilized than the previous Chinese regimes. The story is about how a group of outlaws rise up against the tyrannical power and defeats the government forces. Later, they are recruited by the emperor to defeat invaders and enemies. They manage to dismantle emperor's enemies, but this comes at a huge cost as most of them die and some give up military life to live normal lives. At the end, the leader, Song Jiang, is poisoned. Thus ends the heroic tale of those outlaws. It was actually banned during the Ming Dynasty due to its subject matter being rebellion by outlaws. Somewhat similar to Romance of the Three Kingdoms, Water Margin is about male friendship and bonds, so some suggest it depicts women negatively. The authorship is also unclear whether Shi Naian wrote the whole 100 chapters or parts of it. Water Margin also belongs to the 4 great Chinese classic novels. So it's an incredibly important work of Chinese literature. Now, the next novel takes us away from politics into a religious realm. Journey to the West by Wu Chengyan, who lived between 1500 and 1582. Journey to the West was also written during the Ming Dynasty. It is perhaps the most popular classic novel in China. It's set during the Tang Dynasty, which ruled China between 1600 and 900 CE, the golden period of Chinese civilization. The story is about a Buddhist monk, Tan Xuanzang, and his companions, the most important of them being Sun Wukong, a monkey who's immortal. Unlike the 2 previous novels, this has a more mythical tone. So the monk and his entourage are on their way to India to bring back some Buddhist religious texts back to China. It is also a pretty long novel with 100 chapters. As it transpires, the journey couldn't be more treacherous and difficult for them due to various attacks by demons and monsters. It's more like the 7 Adventures of Sinbad or Herculean Adventures. But in this novel, it is not the physical strength that matters, it's more about ingenuity, the power of thinking, mostly of the resourceful monkey. Thus, the novel is sometimes titled The Monkey King. Although the physical journey gives the novel its space, but ultimately it's an inner spiritual journey, seeing according to Buddhism. It's a fantasy and mythological novel written in the form of folk tales. Unlike the previous 2 classic novels, Journey to the West is less about military and war and more about myths, legends, and Buddhism. It's also part of the 4 great classic novels of China. Now, from a religious journey to the realm of sex, money, and corruption. The Plum and the Golden Vase by Lang Lin Xiao Shang. Quote, this single conversation had such an effect on the old lady that she was ready to fart ferociously and pee in her pants in her excitement. End quote. There's a legend the author wrote it to revenge his father's murderer, who he sent a copy of this book smeared with poison, and the murderer couldn't stop reading it and died by the time he had finished the story. The English translator of this novel, Todd Roy, spent 20 years translating the novel and published it in 1994 in 3,000 pages, similar to Proust's novel In Search of Lost Time. Xi Menqing, the protagonist of this novel, is a businessman who is so corrupt and so involved in sex that he actually dies at the age of 33 of having too much sex. But that's a crude summary of this novel. It's so much more than that. It's a psychological study of how power abuses, how the obsession with money corrupts society and your soul, and how sex can be beautiful as well as terrible. This is considered an erotic novel, so much so that it was banned by various regimes in China. It's not part of the 4 great classic novels simply due to its explicit sex scenes that some even say it's pornographic. In this novel, sex is mundane, like any other everyday acts, like eating, drinking, or taking a piss. For example, at one point during an oral sex scene, before the man ejaculates, the woman casually mentions that they have been invited to someone's house. Okay, you have to read this novel to actually believe your eyes. The Plum and Golden Vase is not part of the 4 great classic novels of China, but it's part of a group of 6 great novels. Okay, from sex and money to a more romantic type of sex in the bedroom. Dream of Red Chambers by Zhao Xuejin, who lived between 1724 and 1763. Dream of Red Chamber, as the title suggests, is about love triangle between 3 cousins, 2 girls and 1 boy. This novel, along with The Three Kingdoms, Water Margins, and Journey to the West, form the 4 great classics. Previous classics were about the fall of empire, politics, and religion, but this is about romantic intrigues and the fall of a great family. It was written in vernacular Chinese language and has a very tragic ending. In many ways, it's somewhat similar to The Tale of Genji by Lady Murasaki of Japan in terms of romance, family dramas, the many poetry contests, psychological depth, and everyday observations. It's also a very long novel with so many characters that depicts 18th century China beautifully. Unlike the previous novels, this is more in the mold of modern novels of psychological depth and sociological observations. Its realism and more rounded characters show a clear break from classical literature, where elements of myths and fantasy formed the bulk of the novel and the characters were less developed. Dream of Red Chamber is about materialism and idealism, or reality and dream. Okay, now we enter the modern period. Now we see more common themes that we saw in Russian literature. Pre-communist revolution issues which crop up a lot in the 19th century Russian novels are shown here in the 20th century China. And the first name on the list is also the most important name in modern Chinese literature. A Madman's Diary by Le Xun. No video in Chinese literature is complete without mentioning Le Xun. I've already discussed A Madman's Diary in a separate video in which I also compared it with Nikolai Gogol's short story of the same title, which inspired Le Xun. Just to give you a flavor, it's about a man who thinks he's the only sane person in town and everybody else is mad. He thinks people are real cannibals and eat babies. Le Xun is hugely popular in China, taught in schools like Shakespeare is taught in English-speaking world. Mao Zedong was a huge fan of him. A Madman's Diary is an attack on the old Confucian traditional way of thinking, which Mao broke off. But Le Xun wrote the short story 30 years before Mao took power in China. For more, please watch my other video. The next one on the list is also a hugely influential novel in China. The Family by Ba Jin. Ba Jin, who lived between 1904 and 2005, was an anarchist whose novels were extremely popular in China in the first part of the 20th century. He spent a few years in France and he lived to be 100 years old. His most well-known novel is Family, and sometimes compared to A Dream of Red Chamber due to its subject matter being a family, and also it's very autobiographical. It's about the fortunes and misfortunes of 3 sons of a wealthy Chinese family that goes through a huge change from fixed tradition to revolution. 4 generations of Cao family during the tumultuous period of the early 20th century when old traditionalists and new revolutionaries were in conflict. It is packed with drama, conflict, romantic interest, and socio-political upheaval, so it's one of the best works of the early 20th century China. The question it tackles is this: do you choose traditional duties or do you break with tradition and define things yourself? But with any change, there are struggles and hardship. Nobody is immune from hardship here. Even the patriarch's rage confines him to his bed. In a way, it reminded me of Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky, and how each brother is very different. The oldest son follows tradition, the middle son is a romantic one, and the youngest son is an all-in revolutionary. It's also somewhat similar to Father and Son by Ivan Turgenev in terms of conflict between generations, young men challenging their parents and grandparents. This novel gives you a real foundational knowledge of what came later in 1949 with the Communist Revolutionary China, in the same way that Dostoevsky and Turgenev were writing about social conflicts that resulted in the Russian October Revolution of 1917. The next novel is not in the mold of Russian novels, but more of English novels, namely Charles Dickens style. Rickshaw Boy or Camel Zhangzi by Lao She. Lao She is perhaps the most Western of all writers on this list. He studied in London and was heavily influenced by Charles Dickens to focus his energy to tell stories of ordinary poor. His style is quite unique as he combined classic Chinese storytelling techniques. Scenes are broken down into episodes and flavored with lots of humor. His most famous novel is Rickshaw Boy, written in the northern Chinese dialect of Manchu. It is about the collapse of the older traditions and values. Its protagonist is a rickshaw puller in Beijing in 1920s who goes through life with the belief that he should do everything to better his life. Nothing goes his way. As soon as he manages to acquire something, it is snatched away from him. But he doesn't lose heart. He goes on and tries something different. But the world is very cruel, very corrupt, and very unfair. Years go by and he finally realizes that there's no point in all of this struggle and he decides to become a lazy loafer like everybody else. I think it's about the frustration of some poor people who worked their ass off but still couldn't change their lives due to socio-political establishment. It's a critique of how individuals always struggled when faced with society, especially economically. You can see the desire for a class revolution back then in China that allowed Mao to establish the communist regime. Okay, now we move into the communist period in China. Red Sorghum by Mo Yan. Mo Yan, born in 1955, is perhaps the most famous Chinese writer today, and his pen name, which means don't speak in Chinese. He was the first Chinese to win the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2012, who still lives in China. Red Sorghum is his first and most well-known novel. The novel tells the story of a family in eastern part of China over a period of 50 years and 3 generations of the same family as China experienced the Japanese occupation, Cultural Revolution, and China-Japan ties later on. The family runs a distillery where they turn sorghum into wine, but due to the upheaval of war, they turn freedom fighters against the Japanese, later fight in civil wars and participate in the Communist Cultural Revolution. Ma Yan is a master of storytelling, vivid language, and an intense voice, so by reading this you realize he's a genius writer. If you have to read a Chinese novel, you have to read one by Mo Yan. The next author is actually my favorite Chinese novelist. To Live by Yu Hua. Yu Hua, born in 1960, is one of the best-known novelists of contemporary Chinese literature who belongs to a new wave or avant-garde movement. I reviewed his other novel, Chronicle of a Blood Merchant here, which is a wonderful novel. His most famous novel is To Live, published in 1992, that made him famous. The narrator of this novel travels to rural areas to collect folk tales and song, but encounters an old man who tells his own story, the story of China, revolutions, and wars, but through the lens of one man who witnesses as his family members die one by one until only he remains. As a young son of a wealthy warlord, he was extremely spoiled, so he squandered his wealth by gambling and paying prostitutes. But after the death of his father, he decides to become a farmer. But life is extremely tough. Soon he loses his mother, then his son and wife, and he is left with an ox as a companion. It's a really sad story of how fleeting life is, how tough it is for people of rural China, and how cruel history is. Yu Hua's stories are full of humanity and goodness, despite all the terrible hardship. Okay, to sum up, the first 5 novels are classic and the last 5 novels are modern. The contrast is massive. Classic novels show no Western influence, while latter novels were heavily influenced by West, especially by Russian literature. It makes sense since both countries had a socialist revolution. Ideologically, they share a lot in common. Thank you.